Conversation with Ron MacLean.
Welcome to In Conversation. Today on the show, Dr. Cheryl MacDonald, a sports sociologist currently working on her postdoctoral work at St. Mary's University in Halifax, joined by Brock McGillis, who is a goaltender who played in the Ontario Hockey League, also played professional hockey in the East Coast Hockey League, the Premiership in the Netherlands, and youth sport. He's openly gay. Brock came out in 2016, and together, Cheryl and Brock have been co-conspirators in educating folks on the rights, the experiences of citizens in the LGBTQ2+ community. In Cheryl's case, like Brock, she played hockey and she was a goaltender. And it was actually a chance encounter, a conversation with Georges Larac that led to her shifting her focus somewhat in her research and her academia to focus on issues pertaining to gay rights, and especially to gay rights with respect to hockey and the conspiracy of silence around the notion of could you be a gay player in men's team sports, as I say, specifically hockey. Enter Brock McGillis. As I mentioned, 2016 is when Brock came out. He has been doing tremendous work, much like our colleague on the Fan 590, Scott MacArthur. His story was truly educational and inspirational on the idea of maintaining one's silence and the trauma associated with that, relationships, your friends, and your family. So Brock is doing work on social media. He is doing some sports training. He's doing some media to help facilitate the conversation. And I think that's the biggest thing as we have this show called In Conversation. Brock and Dr. MacDonald will illustrate that if you want to fit in and to play team sport, specifically men's hockey, not the women's game, and we'll address that, but if you want to be safe and to be accepted, the trade-off is your silence.
And I struggled with mental illness. I've had an anxiety disorder since I was 7. I've been depressed through my hockey career, dealing with my sexuality, suicidal, struggled a lot, numbed a lot with alcohol. And when I started speaking publicly about all of it, I sort of relived it. And I relived it in a lot of different forms. I relived it by sharing it, but I also relived it because now people come to me with their struggle. And people come to me on a daily basis. And initially it was so overwhelming. I mean, the first day alone when I came out publicly, I received over 10,000 messages.
I also find that the kids are struggling with it themselves, certainly the young ones, when I speak to them one-on-one in our interviews. Either they actually don't have a problem with homosexuality, or they're very cognizant of the fact that they've developed their opinions from other friends, from family members. I had one who said, well, my father told me it's wrong, so it's wrong. I've had others who said, you know, I live in a community of 200 people. I've never seen a gay person, let alone a trans person, so I don't know what to do with that. No, I'm not just okay with it.
And really pleased to be joined by Dr. MacDonald, who we just saw on Sports Inclusive with Craig Eagles, who's a dear friend, and just great to see that representing Rogers there in Moncton. And also, of course, we're joined by Brock, who we just saw with Tara Sloan. And Brock, I've been missing Rogers hometown hockey, so you did her meditation for those who can't sit still, and it was a brilliant episode on Instagram. Thank you for that, and thanks to you and Tara for that. So listen, it might take the half hour, but why don't I just open the floor to you to tell me a little bit your story.
So, yeah, it might take the half hour. I, in 2016, came out, and at the time I was the only, and I guess the first, openly gay male professional hockey player. I grew up in Ontario, in Sudbury, and I played AAA junior hockey, went on to play in the OHL and professionally in the States and Europe, as well as playing Concordia. And I struggled. I struggled based off the fact that I was gay. I struggled based off the fact that I felt like I needed to hide it in order to conform and fit into hockey culture. And I numbed for a lot of years with alcohol. I was suicidal. I was very depressed, and it definitely impacted my career. And you know, I didn't reach the levels I was supposed to reach. I was constantly injured, and finally I had enough. In 2016, I penned an article or letter coming out, and since then I've been traveling the world, working as an LGBTQ plus activist, advocate, I don't know, whichever, and sharing my story and trying to humanize homophobia within society, within culture, within sport culture.
And Dr. MacDonald, your work kind of took a turn when you had a conversation with Georges Laraque. I was mentioning in the preamble that sort of set you on the path that really has been a decade now, which kind of mixes academia and, if you want, advocacy. So tell me about that.
Sure. I started off studying masculinity in ice hockey, and when I started my PhD, I was looking for something that I could sink my teeth into for 4 whole years. And my partner at the time happened to land me a phone call with Georges Laraque, and during the phone call, I asked if someone had 4 years to dedicate to studying masculinity in ice hockey, what would they study? And he said, "You need to figure out why it's not okay to be gay." Um, he told me to start with the younger ones because I wasn't going to change the minds of any older ones. And that he knew there were gay men in the NHL, but it was safest for them to stay closeted, and that it was my job to figure out why. So it unleashed a pretty solid career for me, and I've met lots of wonderful people. Brock reached out to me, and that has started a wonderful friendship, if not a partner in crime business type thing. And it has gone from there. On the advocacy side, I had the opportunity to work with the You Can Play project, which is a partner of the NHL that does their You Can Play nights, like their Pride nights. That was an incredible opportunity out in Edmonton. I got to work with the co-creators of Pride Tape, and now I'm back east.
I can't tell you, Brock, how much I admired and respected Brendan Burke, Brian's son, Patrick's brother. Got to know him a lot, especially during the 27 Stanley Cup run for the Anaheim Ducks. So we lost him, and it's his legacy You Can Play. Tell me about your relationship with Brendan.
Well, actually, Brendan is the reason I came out to my family. I remember watching a Leafs game one night, and Brendan was being interviewed between periods, and I wasn't really paying attention. I was just listening, and it was like background noise, some young guy talking about following in his father's footsteps and making the NHL as a general manager. And then something that he said really struck me. He said, and I'm gay. And for me, the only time I'd ever heard that in terms of in the hockey world was when one player was calling another player gay. So it shocked me, caught me off guard completely. And Ron, as you're aware, the hockey world's a very small place. So I reached out to Brendan, and we instantly became friends. For me, it was such relief. He was one of, if not the first person I ever told that I was gay. I was still playing at the time. And I think it was nice for him too to have somebody who he could, who understood what he was going through, and that duality of being a gay man and in this hypermasculine sport. So we became really good friends, chatted almost every day. And then one day he sent me a text, and it said, "I can't wait for the day that you're out to your family like I am to mine." I didn't answer him. And not because I didn't think my family would be inclusive or supportive. In fact, I knew they would be. They had told me since, I was young, they'd always support me and love me and include me. But I feared that my brother was a first round pick in the OHL, played professionally, and my father scouted in the OHL and coached AAA and junior hockey for almost 30 years. And I feared that they would become more sensitive to the language used in locker rooms and stand up to it. And in the process, they would out me, which would jeopardize any opportunities that I had in the game. So I ignored Brendan's message. And 2 days later, Brendan passed away in a car accident. And those ended up being the last words he ever said to me. And at that point, I decided I had to do something. I felt so alone. So I sat my brother down. My brother is a 6'2", 200-pound, hyper-masculine, macho hockey bro who fought, scored goals, hit people. And I said, "Corey, I'm gay." And he said, "Yeah, so you're Brock. I love you." And I went, "That's it? Like, that's all I get?" And I ended up telling my parents shortly thereafter, but I didn't tell anyone in hockey.
But go on, because in Sudbury, everybody, I think, you tell me what the reaction in Sudbury, and how ultimately there is there was a great Matt Larkin story that you did with the Hockey News that kind of details what happens next. So I would love you to continue.
Yeah. So when I even after I retired from playing, and I feared that I wouldn't get opportunities in the game. And I feared that I wouldn't be able to, and because I had all the injuries and depression and struggles and whatnot, I knew if I was going to make a career out of hockey, it would be the long road, right? It wasn't that linear path of OHL, AHL, NHL. So I knew any bump in that road would have jeopardized any opportunity, any shot. So I continued to hide it, and then I retired and I moved back to Sudbury, and as most ex-hockey players do, I stayed in the game. I began working with athletes, doing off-ice training, on-ice skill development, and I also coached. And I didn't want to tell anyone there because I feared that, I mean, it's Northern Ontario, and there isn't a ton of exposure to diversity in general, let alone the LGBTQ plus community. So I feared that if parents found out that I was gay, they wouldn't let their children work with me. And then one day I got a phone call from Hockey Mom. And Ron, you're probably aware of this, but hockey parents are a unique breed of human. And this call was a little different than most. I would get hundreds of calls daily, but this one was a little different. This mother calls me and says, "Brock, I want to set you up on a date." And I said, "Oh no, what am I going to do? What am I going to say?" And I just said, what's her name?" And she said, "Steve." I said, "What?" She said, "Brock, you're gay." I said, "How do you know this?" And she said, "Oh, my son told me." And her son was 15 at the time. And I said, "How does he know this?" She's like, "Oh, all the boys know. They've known for years." And at the time I was predominantly working with male players. And then I began to panic. My heart was racing. I was like, this is my job. What am I going to do? Like, how they're all going to leave. They're not going to want to work with me. And then I thought, well, they all know. All these cocky hockey boys who walk around like they, own every room they're in, know I'm gay and choose to work with me. In Northern Ontario. How cool is that? And I thought about coming out to them, but I didn't. I decided instead to observe their behaviors. I became a bit of a Cheryl in the sense that I did a little sociology experiment where I started to observe. I always tried to curb racist, sexist, and homophobic language with my athletes. And I started to notice that anytime they'd say something homophobic, they'd freeze up and apologize to me. And I'd shrug my shoulders and nod and let it go. And I thought, cool, maybe I'm creating a shift. Maybe I'm humanizing this for them and a shift is happening. And then I thought, or maybe they like me, so they're, apologizing to me, but they go into the locker room, they go to school, they go on the ice, and they use homo-negative language. And I really had no idea until one day I wasn't there. And my athletes were working with a track coach. And they were at the end of a 2-hour workout, and the coach said, you have 10 more 200-meter sprints. And a younger player comes from a super progressive family. Father gives me a hug and tells me he's walking this journey with me. Mother's a dear friend of mine. Looks at the sprint coach and says, "This is so gay. I can't believe you're making us do this." And one of the older players who was more entrenched in the culture, who's playing in the OHL, looked at him and said, "We don't say that here. Give me 50 push-ups." And that became something my athletes adopted. And they took it beyond, these kids are social influencers, and they took it beyond our little bubble within hockey, so insular, but within the insular bubble of hockey, we had this bubble. And they took it beyond that. They took it to their teammates. They took it to school, and it became something that started to just grow. And before I knew it, like, there was one night, this young man, he was 15, was on FaceTime with a young woman, and she said, "Let's hang out." And he said, "No, I can't have practice." And she said, "That's so gay. You never want to hang out with me." And he said, "Give me 50 push-ups right now or I'm never talking to you again." And she did the push-ups. And these are two people I'd never met before and still haven't met. And that's when I recognized that these shifts can happen. We can shift this culture. We can shift society.
intersectional justice. We had an incredible moment the other day. Matt Dumba was on from the Minnesota Wild talking about Dylan Hetherington, who's with Dallas, and how he's white and Matt's Filipino. And he just said, "I'm sorry if I said anything, back when." And it was just great. Just great. So, Dr. MacDonald, you heard all that, and this is your study. So I'll just leave you the floor open to go on about that.
Sure. It has been really interesting for me because I'm now at a point where I have interviewed straight male hockey players at elite levels, as well as openly gay men's hockey players who have played at elite levels, and younger ones too. I did a lot of work with Major Midget AAA during my PhD. So seeing both sides of this topic has been fascinating for me, and that includes the ones who don't understand, the ones who aren't comfortable on either side. It has been really cool to be able to assemble what's actually happening, because the question I'm asked the most is, why are there no openly gay men in the NHL? What is it about the NHL? What is it about hockey that makes it so unique? And in some ways, I could argue that it's not just hockey. It's a sports thing. It might be even a masculinity thing more broadly, but we're in Canada and hockey is a very big deal. It's a lifestyle, it's a business, it's entertainment. I always include that it takes over Christmas, right? World Juniors is sometimes more important than Christmas for some families. So I think that's why hockey in particular is what we focus on. And to sort of pick up on Brock's notion of humanizing the matter, the most fulfilling part of my job is hearing about how folks in the hockey community can talk about how they've gotten to know someone who identifies as a member of the LGBTQ2 community, because that is normally how we create the most change, is once we learn that other folks really aren't all that different from us. We understand and respect them a lot more. And so over the course of my 10 years, I can tell you that probably around 2014, when I was dealing with Major Midget AAA players, I think like almost half of them couldn't tell me what LGBTQ stood for. And I mean, I had jokesters. I had some that, wrote Liam goes back to Quebec and things like that. And I'll never know if they actually knew what it meant or not, because I think that's a context where you're not expected to take people seriously, let alone be taken seriously. But I do know that right up to the former NHL players that I have worked with in the past couple of years, they're way more educated than they were, way more knowledgeable. So it has been really cool to see that shift over time to a more comfortable place with that community, to a more educated place. And Brock has been such a huge part of that, because there was a time when he was really the only example we had. And I think he's still probably the most visible example that we have, but I think he has led the way. And so technically it's a good thing that he's not the only one anymore. I think it's thanks to him that we've seen a lot of this change. So I have a lot of hope for us moving forward, despite the negativity that we do see, for sure.
Coming out, Brock, comes with you're anchored in a moment now. You're anchored in a story that you're told to tell a lot and joyfully do, but that's exhausting. And I would love your sort of take on that, the position of advocacy as pertains to if you were to come out in the National Hockey League now and be the one, the distraction element. I know Dr. MacDonald and you have discussed this, but that's one. And then just, reconciling it's just such trauma for the gay athlete to suppress, to remain silent, to have the secret, and the isolation that comes with that, the feeling of hopelessness, the relationship impact, versus the player who now might be homophobic and needs to be walked through, getting over that. So those are two separate questions: being the advocate and what it's meant to your life, and then how you reconcile the balancing act that it becomes.
I think, when I first told my story, it was emotional. It was difficult. The words were tough to say, but it became empowering. And now it doesn't feel like enough. Now it's there's something I realized recently, and it was shocking. I feel like I have a traumatic relationship with hockey, and it comes when, like, uh, for me, and this is going to go into your second question as well, is before we, I don't care if somebody's homophobic. That's their choice. It usually comes from lack of humanization, lack of knowledge, lack of education, and I think, those things come in order. But my now the difficult part is, like, I beg these associations, whether it's the Ontario Hockey Federation, whether it's, the GTHL. I've pleaded with the OHL to make, and they've let me in their doors. I'm forever grateful to them, but to make it mandatory, and across the CHL, to bring somebody like myself, somebody who's played the game and understands what it's like to be in that locker room, and share the story and humanize it for them, because hockey is very insular. And the trauma comes from when they say no, or when they don't engage with you, or they go, well, how is this possible? How could we do this? And I'm thinking, well, you tell me right now that a corporate partner wouldn't take a series of minority people who've been in the sport and fund a tour like that? Like, come on. And that gatekeeping aspect brings me back to the point where I felt rejected, where I felt like I wasn't enough, where I felt like I couldn't be me. And thinking about all those kids that are probably feeling that way and don't have that resource or that person coming in the room to make people aware of the importance of the language used. Because, to touch on what Cheryl said, today's generation is far more inclusive in thought. And I know, I've been in the rooms and I talk to the kids, but they still use homophobic language, they tell me. And after that, and after we humanize and then educate them, we got to break down conformity. We got to break down the barriers of conformity in the sport. And I do it. Like, I'll go into locker rooms, Ron, and I'll ask them, I'll be like, okay, you tell me your family or your brothers, and this specifically the men's hockey, because I think women's hockey has entirely different sets of, inclusion practices and also their own issues within it. But I'll say, tell me something you wouldn't typically tell a teammate that you enjoy. Because from my experience and the experience of many of them, it's all you're allowed talking about is women, partying, sports. So tell me something else. And I had a veteran in one of the leagues, major junior league, say, I love writing poetry. His coach said, I love Broadway musicals. Another player said, if I don't make the NHL, I'm going to be a zoologist. And then a first-year player literally jumped out of his seat and said, I love animal documentaries. And when we bond on a deeper level and we break down those barriers of conformity and of masculinity, or whatever you want to call it, then, that Muslim kid that walks in the room is going to feel like, okay, I can be here. Then that person of color who walks in the room, the Black player who, isn't necessarily understood and doesn't see anyone like himself, may feel a little more comfortable. Then the kid who stands up and says, I'm gay, will feel like they are, able to say that in a safe space. So, the trauma today, like, I feel empowered telling my story, because each time I think about those kids in those rooms, each school, each corporate I go into, and this is something like I do. I'm certified in diversity and inclusion from Cornell. Like, I travel around speaking about this stuff. I consult for corporates on it. It's doable. We can shift hockey culture to make it inclusive for all. And I've seen it, and I've seen the impact that sport has. I've had kids come to me who are cutting themselves, who then one kid found bodybuilding. And that gave him a sense of purpose, a sense of hope, something to do every day. It empowered him. Shouldn't that be hockey in Canada?
Feels like there's a seismic shift happening, on so many levels of systems of oppression. Sport lagged behind. So, Dr. MacDonald, you one of the things you do in your work is you curate, coordinate, help host the hockey conference. 2 years ago, it was the University of Alberta. Brock was a speaker. Carl Subban, Hunter Ryan Singh, just unbelievable. Roger LeBlanc caught my attention with his research at Université de Moncton, where he spoke to the New Zealand gay athletes about the fear wasn't teammates, the fear was public opinion. So I think you can go on with that idea. If society has shifted its thinking, if we're at a crossroads, obviously in our world right now with intersectional justice issues, might this be the time?
I think so. I'd like to think it's the time, but I also have a feeling based on what I've seen that it's going to be slow moving. As you said, sport lags behind the rest of society. We know that research has shown that time and again. So, and I also think too that different folks have different expectations for how much change should happen and how quickly. And that for me is the toughest part, because I would love to wake up tomorrow and be in an inclusive society. And I used to be someone that harbored a lot of anger because I didn't know why everybody didn't also see it that way, why it was so difficult. And so I have sort of learned to expect that might be slower than we want, but it's happening. The thing I always start off with lately is the fact that we wouldn't be doing something like this show even 10 years ago, probably.
Mm-hmm.
I might not have been doing this research 15 or 20 years ago, probably. And what we are seeing, which again, I have trouble with, but I think it's our current reality, is that the hockey community is becoming open to certain groups. So, for instance, Brock is granted access into that community because he is a white man, because he is masculine. So he's not totally different from them. Well, from them as in the general collective. And so I think you're seeing that right now with Black identities, especially. There are Black men in the NHL, there are Black people in hockey. And so you are beginning to see more acceptance of that community. And you had Dr. Courtney Cito on with you recently, who's done tremendous work with the South Asian community. And I think that hockey is opening up to them. A place that I think we need to do more work is with trans identities. I think that those folks aren't as far ahead in terms of acceptance. Thankfully, we have lovely folks like Harrison Brown and Jessica Platt who are leading the way for that. So I think there are groups that are more disenfranchised than others and than I would like. But I do see some folks being brought into the fold more. And the beautiful thing is that they're leading the way for others. So I think because of that, it's going to be a slow process, but at least it's starting. And I think that as much as there are some difficult conversations going on right now about gender, about sexual orientation, about race, even about religion, you name it. Like you said, these intersectional identities that all come together, because we're not just one thing, right? We're not just our race or our religion or our sexual orientation. We're all of those things together. And I think sometimes folks can get caught up on the one thing about somebody that might stand out or that is different. And I really wish I knew from where I stand how to do a better job of getting folks to focus less on that. But I think, to circle back to what both you and Brock have mentioned, it's this thing about conformity. It's very rampant in the hockey community, but I think it's a human thing where we're really comfortable with what we know and what we understand. So if someone is somehow different from us, our walls go up a little bit. And that has especially been the case in the hockey community. In my work, the former NHL players especially were quite well versed in this idea of being a distraction. The word distraction has defined my research lately, because they said that perhaps being gay was more of a distraction than some other things, but the reality is that when you're playing top level hockey, um, whether you are concussed or injured, whether you have mental health problems, whether you have drug and alcohol addictions, um, any kind of baggage that might take away from the team, take away success, take away focus. If you aren't a quiet, humble hockey player, you are a distraction, and there's somebody that has your skill set coming up behind you that might not have that same baggage that will take your job. And so it's easiest to downplay anything about you that's different, um, in order to fit in. And what ends up happening as a result of that, uh, is racism, sexism, homophobia, or anti-gay attitudes, if you will. And that trickles down into things like hazing, right? So um, I really want to stress that you aren't just one thing. Nobody is just one thing. And if we can embrace that about ourselves and about each other, I think we would see a path forward much quicker.
Thank you, Cheryl. This is Mark Tewksbury's book, Inside Out. And when it came out, I actually interviewed Mark in 2008 at the Beijing Olympics, and it didn't go over well. There was, some criticism of the audacity to speak to that subject. That's 2008. So 12 years later, I feel a huge difference. Final question, Brock. Who gets to lead, and how should the leadership be done?
I think what we've seen in society in this last little while is a humanizing of an issue, and to what Cheryl said about hockey, and here's where I think hockey is struggling with these issues is hockey is incredibly insular in the sense that compared to most other sports, you're isolated off in an arena. You're with the same people 6 nights a week in the same locker room at the same age from the age of like 7 or 8 years old until you're 16. And then you move away from home at a very young age. And when you do, your only friends typically are your 20 teammates or 22 teammates. And then you hang out with them 7 days a week. And then once your season's over, you go home back to where you came from and train with the people you grew up with. So you're with the exact same people who talk the same, dress the same, act the same. And like, I know I can walk into any mall in Canada and any school I speak at, and I know the kids who play hockey right away. And it's the conformity aspect. And the issue with that is then once those people are done playing, they become coaches. They run associations, they become general managers of team, like they work their way up in hockey, and that's great. And most of them are phenomenal people, except because it's so insular, they haven't been exposed to anything different than themselves, which means that the people who can't conform fully leave, or others fake who they are. And the problem is they're the ones trying to create the change right now. They're the ones not letting people in the door who have the lived experience, but also have, been a part of the game to understand that. And to what Cheryl said, like, I have a lot of privilege in the sense that I am let in some doors, but I'm not let into all of them yet. And so people like myself, people who have the lived experience of being a Black male hockey player, people who have the lived experience of been in the men's sport as a woman and experienced sexism, people who have the lived experience of having, suffered from mental illness while being in the sport. We need to have those voices come together collectively and start sharing this to the masses. And we need the people who are running those associations, organizations, to allow this to happen. From there, in my opinion, then we have people like Cheryl, people like Courtney, different academics who can implement the educational component. Because if you start with education, you haven't humanized and people don't realize this is a problem and this is an issue, then they're not going to do the education. We saw it with players as soon as, the social injustice that's going on across the world right now. Players start to speak out when their eyes were open, they were humanized, and now they're willing to be educated. Mm-hmm. We need to educate. We need powerful stories that will get them, and it should be a 3-tiered system: NHL, major, junior, because I think they have the most influence in our country. They're in every town and they're accessible. They're treated like NHL players, and minor hockey. And if we did that, and it can be done, I know it can. I've gone across the country and back. I see you go across the country every Sunday. Mm-hmm. It's possible to do. And if we did that, I think we would shift this culture and add to the already incredible sport and all the values and characteristics that hockey gives us, like work ethic and learning to listen to a coach and teamwork and all of these wonderful things. But these social issues are also things that we should be learning.
Brock McGillis, Dr. Cheryl MacDonald. Fantastic, you two. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ron.
Just great. So a couple of things there. Dr. MacDonald's hockey conference will now take place next year, 2021, in Halifax. And Brock McGillis, if you want to reach him on Twitter, it's Brock_McGillis. And on Instagram, you can get him at BrockMcGillis33. If you want to approach him for help with what you're doing, or if you want to just talk, Brock is there for you. We're back on Wednesday with Shad and Peter and Leia of July Talk. That's 70T4 Pacific. As always, we close with a song lyric, and it's from Philadelphia Freedom, one of my favorite ever. Till the whirlpool of freedom zapped me right between the eyes. Elton John and Bernie Taupin. For all of us, thanks for watching today, and so long.